First item on the agenda is citizen comment. Any citizen wishing to render comment, please step forward to the podium, state your name and address, and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Citizen invitation going once, twice, 3 times. There being no one in the council chambers to render comment, no citizens in the chambers to render comment, we've satisfied this element of the agenda. Next item on the agenda, approval of the June 21, 2017 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Do I hear a motion to approve?
I make a motion to approve.
Thank you. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Proposals for amendments? There being none, all in favor of approving the minutes, raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, raise your hand and say nay. Any abstentions? There being none, the motion carries. The minutes are approved. Next item on the agenda, neighborhood business zone review continued. I invite to the presentation table the city staff and consultants.
Good evening, Planning Commission, and thank you for being here at 6 p.m. on this beautiful sunny evening. I'm sure you'd prefer to be enjoying the sunny evening, but I guess you can see it out the window. So tonight, the discussion continues on neighbourhood business zone, and we're starting here at 6 so that Arthur Sullivan with ARCH can give you a presentation and outline some options regarding possibilities for incorporating affordable housing into the neighbourhood business zone. So Arthur has another meeting to go to. He's very busy at the moment, so I believe Arthur needs to leave at 7. So we'll let Arthur go through the presentation. And would you prefer questions as we go along, or leave until the end? So if there are any questions, then please raise your hand, and the chair can recognise you, and Arthur can answer those questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So good evening, and I can stay a little after 7. The other meeting I need to be on, I'm a little later on the agenda, so they start at 7:30. So I can probably leave here around 7:15 and still be, if you need a little extra time with questions and stuff. So yes, please feel free to ask questions as we go. The intention here is to give you an opportunity to sort of walk. At the last meeting, we I just want to make sure, yeah, okay. At the last meeting, we talked about how your Tier 1 strategies included looking at opportunities when you're looking at zoning, and we also showed you charts, and you said you were intrigued, so we're back here tonight to have the little more detailed conversation, a little bit slower, so that you can ask your questions, and hopefully, at least by the end of tonight, at least understand the issues and choices and options, and either make a recommendation in a thing or where you have follow-up questions. So as again, reminder from last meeting, this is a chart, and I believe you got copies of this in your packet. We sent that out with this is the same materials that you received in your packet. This is the current parcels within each of the NB zones that you are looking at, the north and the south. I will point out, because it might be relevant later on when we talk about one of the issues, which is minimum project sizes. You'll notice that a lot of the parcels right now seem to allow anywhere from 2 to 5 units at this point under their current zoning. So I just sort of made a note of that as I was looking at this, and that might be relevant as we go on. The components of the conversation we'd like to have with you tonight, or for you to have tonight, is the first 2 are probably the most substantial components of looking at affordability, which is what affordability level and how many units would be affordable. And we've come to you with a couple of options to consider under that second bullet. We don't have a staff recommendation on which way to go. We may have recommendations if you decide which way to go, how you might do those. And then there's some other elements too that like the threshold development size and alternative compliance that we also want to talk with you tonight and walk through those issues. And then we'll also sort of do a recap of what have been standard provisions for your city and pretty much all cities, somewhat driven by state legislation that are typical of provisions that would be included. You also received in your packet an attempt to sort of take and draft a zoning ordinance. I think we want to sort of focus on the business components, but we can refer if you have questions about where does that translate to in the draft code language. And you'll notice we did a lot of shading in that document. The yellow shading is where we were sort of saying, depending on where you go with options, that section would have to be looked at. So, for example, we gave you one whole section on if you went with a more mandatory approach, and we gave you a whole section on if you went with a voluntary approach. And depending on which way you go, you would drop one, and then you'd fill in the blanks that are in there. We also tried to show you that we did try to, as much as we could, we really looked hard at what you already have on your zoning regulations, especially for the overlay district and the central area. So we shaded those areas, the language that we included in the draft code language that is taken from there, we did in gray shading so you can see where we are trying to, as much as possible, mimic what is already on the books for another part of the city. So with that framework, are there any questions before we jump in and start going through the list?
Anybody? Jump in.
Okay. Okay, so the first question is, what is the affordability level that you would want to land at? And it may even be helpful on this and the next one. You can put your thoughts and perspectives out there, but you may not want to get to a final point of what you think is right until you sort of do the next item too, because they do have a tendency to go hand in hand. But I did want to give you some background and context, and then answer questions you may have about that, and and then open it up to for your comments. We have seen cities over the last 10 years or so do a variety of different affordability levels when they're doing their land use provisions. Most seem to be in the 70 or 80% of median income level. The general philosophy is that the economic gain is the economic gain, from the increased density. And that doesn't change. So if you look at one affordability versus another affordability, generally the trade-off is, if you want a more affordable level, then in order to be rational and reasonable for the incentive offered, you would ask for a lower amount of affordability. So they have a tendency just to sort of go hand in hand with each other. If one goes up, the other one goes down, kind of thing. And so different cities have, sometimes they're doing really big bonuses like you are in your overlay. It actually builds up to a point where you get to 50% of median and even lower, but you also had a huge bonus you were doing, and that was something the council wanted to do, and the Citizens Task Force. The other thing, too, is that increasingly cities are distinguishing the affordability levels between rental and ownership housing. And the primary reason for that is, for as long as I have been doing this, if you ask for a unit to be affordable, and I'll just say 80% of median, and what we are always doing in our analysis is comparing what is a rent at 80% of median compared to the market rent for a new building, not average rents in the city. We look at for the new building, because that's who you're asking someone to do it. So what kind of rent are they typically getting in order to get to a yes point? That gap for a rental, when you're at 80% of median to market, is smaller than if you do the same analysis for an ownership project that's priced to be affordable at 80% of median and the market value. Not as much right now as it's been historically, and that's primarily because of the low interest rates that we've been having the last 4 or 5 years. But always a little bit lower. And so that's, as much as anything, the reason why some jurisdictions, including you, have set the affordability level a little bit different, usually about a 10% difference between rental and ownership. So that's sort of the general context from a more broad point of view.
Can you repeat that?
Sure.
Because I didn't understand the gap with new construction being smaller. Is that what you're saying?
No.
Between affordable and market?
No. What I'm saying is, when we do our analysis, we use rents for new units,
New construction.
not average rents in the community.
Right.
Because
Which are going to be
new
higher.
units are higher.
Right.
Exactly. So the gap, and so we want to make sure in our analysis, we're doing it from the point of view of the developer of the new building, not looking at average rents. When you go and do that kind of analysis for new housing in rental, the gap between market and 80% of median for rental, and translating that to a capital value, is less than when you do the analysis for new ownership housing. Okay?
The nominal dollars gap?
Yes. And so, therefore, if the affordability level is about 10% higher, you're making that gap somewhat comparable. Okay? So,
Nominal dollar gap for rental is going to be based on monthly rent, right?
and then you capitalize that,
Okay.
that value.
I see.
So when you do that kind of comparison, it translates to
Okay.
a bigger hit for an ownership builder to do something at the same affordability level as rental. That's the simple
I
way of putting
I
it.
think I get it now.
That's not been nearly as true the last couple years. And that's primarily for two reasons, which is now starting to go away.
Interest rates.
Interest rates is the main reason, and the other is the ownership market, especially in condos, was suppressed during the recession, much more so than rents were. Okay, we're now seeing that second factor go away. So, and so I think for that reason, so that gives you some general background. Now you see what the definitions are in this slide of what affordability level that you are using in the TOD district overlay. And there you landed at a definition of moderate income housing as being 70% for rental and 80% for ownership. And for low income, 50% of median and 65% for ownership. And then the other element of the TOD district is that for every 3 bonus units, 2 are market rate and 1 is affordable at moderate income. Okay, so that's the overlay district.
That we currently have in Kenmore for TOD.
I'm sorry?
That we currently have
Yes.
in the TOD zones of Kenmore.
Correct.
Okay?
Okay?
Lori wanted to add some.
Right. I wanted to jump in just for a minute. Commissioner McDonald was not here, and I'm not sure Commissioner Baker was here either when the TOD
Right.
project was going forward. So TOD stands for Transit-Oriented Development. It's a specific geographic area in the city. It's east of 73rd Avenue Northeast. It runs along SR 522, and it's an area where we did what's called an overlay zoning. And you could either choose to develop under the overlay, or you could choose to develop under the current zoning standards. And if you choose the overlay, you get potentially a very great increase in density. I think it was up to 150 dwelling units per acre. There were some parking alterations. I think there was something about landscaping. And one significant component is that if you developed, again, your choice, if you develop under the TOD overlay to get the greater density, then you have a requirement to provide affordable housing, and that's where these numbers came from.
So we're talking about, are we talking about the Juanita commercial business zones? Okay, we're doing 2 things today then?
No, this is an example that Arthur is presenting of an existing code section in Kenmore, and he's describing how what we have on the books for an existing area that's not the neighborhood business area, how that has addressed affordable housing.
We're using this example for what we're doing on the Juanita business districts.
He's using this example to illustrate this particular point, which has to do with a difference in how ownership versus rental affordability levels have been tackled in other places.
And also to give you context of, this is where we landed a couple years ago. So that might be a starting point for thinking, is that where we should land here? You don't have to, but we wanted to at least explain how that's
Right.
laid out.
And in fact, the recommendations kind of
Right.
followed. That I saw in the materials were like, well, maybe the staff is recommending consider proposing or adopting the TOD incentives.
Right.
I get it now.
Okay? Good. Ask your questions, because the goal here is make sure you in your head, because these numbers sort of dance around a little bit. Usually people get it after a couple iterations. So if we need to do a couple of, ask your questions so we get it through. Yes.
Can you give us an example in the city where there is the potential for using the TOD incentives?
Everywhere you can see out this window, right?
Really? Okay. No, actually, the TOD is, it starts at 73rd Avenue Northeast.
Right.
And it picks up the park and ride. It picks up some areas along 73rd, not very far north. And then it stretches west east along SR 522 and picks up the multifamily zoning that stretches almost to the Bothell boundary.
Okay.
I thought it was bigger. I thought, in fact, we expanded it when we did the downtown
You
rezone.
you expanded it to the east along SR 522. It used to include an area south of 522, and that was eliminated.
I thought there was stuff that, there was a TOD overlay on the west side of 68, of Juanita,
No,
and around City Hall.
no,
Okay, thanks.
no. There are affordability requirements in some of these areas, but it's not the TOD overlay. So that's probably what you're thinking of.
So I have one more question. Thank you for describing that. Would we look at these two little neighborhood business zones as having the potential of being included to keep things, or is the requirement for a TOD overlay, does it require a bigger chunk of land? And you know, obviously these are individually owned parcels, so for someone to buy them all would be probably unusual.
So in different cities, and I think that's how we were looking at it until now, this is not to become another expansion of TOD overlay.
Okay.
It's a zone change. So we've done some in single-family neighborhoods where they've gone from very low-density single-family. It's the same concept, but every district can be different enough that you want to tailor a little bit. If you say, yes, we've triggered the point where we want the linkage made, but what's the right linkage for this site given how big the change is? This doesn't have as big a change as the TOD overlay has.
Sure.
So we're proposing something much simpler.
Yes.
Because the TOD overlay was different base zones and increases to up to 150 units per acre from as low as 20 units per acre, I believe, right?
Okay.
So very different circumstance.
Okay.
So we think this one's a little more straightforward if
Okay.
you elect to sort of go with it.
Okay. Thank you. That
And,
helped.
Carol, you brought to mind something when you raised that question. How long has the TOD overlay been adopted?
I think it was finally adopted in 2015. I believe it was the fall of 2015.
Okay, and I was going to ask, has any developer
I think
taken
we've had.
advantage of that incentive?
I think we've had at least one inquiry. I would have to
Nobody's
ask
started.
Development Services.
Nobody's been permitted for that.
Right.
And I think some of that is, I've been doing this too long. I've had several communities we've worked with. They adopt something like this. Nothing's built for 4 or 5 years, and it wasn't necessarily because of the affordability provisions, just the market wasn't there for
Right.
the type of development proposed. And downtown Redmond, for example, I don't know if any of you have been there recently, they put on a mandatory requirement when they rezoned in like 96. Not much happened for about 5 to 6 years, and now in the last, obviously, 5 years, every one of those buildings has affordability in it now. So that's one thing. Your business is to plan for the future. So that's one of the juggling acts when you do these kind of programs. So to give a little context, and I think I had this chart the last time, to this conversation about affordability level, and this may help to illustrate, again, TOD was done relatively recently. So whereas the other zone I think you were referring to, Chair, was for some property just here, and that was done
Kenmore
like
Village
right. That was done
has
20
mandatory
plus.
affordability.
Right, and that was done
requirements.
like 20 plus years ago.
Right.
So here, what the purpose of this chart is to show you affordability levels at different percents of median. I'm going to be focusing tonight on the rental, but you can see that, in particular, what we wanted to show you is rents at 70 and 80% of median, and then comparing that to average rents, and the chart at the very bottom is showing you average rents overall in Kenmore, Bothell, I think they might be combined together, and then those that are newer. And so that chart shows you how newer buildings typically have higher rents. I think we even used a little bit higher than that in our analysis for the new buildings. And then you start comparing that to the 70 and 80, and as you can see, and one thing I'll also point out is that you'll notice we said 2-bedroom, 1-bath, because typically the general requirement is that if a builder is building units, we look at bedroom mix, not explicit unit design. So if they have 2-bedroom, 1-bath, and 2-bedroom, 2-baths, the 2-bedroom, 1-bath can meet the affordability requirement. They don't if they have both of them, they don't have to give us both 1-bath and 2-bath units. They can do the affordable ones all as 1-bath. So that's why we use the 1-bath rents versus the 2-bedroom, 2-bath rents. And so you can start to see that at 80% of median, you're actually not even that far below the rents for new buildings. And then and then when you start to get to 70% of median, you can start to see it is a bit of a hit on the rents. And you're even starting to be at least at or a little bit below average rents in the city when you start getting to 70%. Now this is this year's numbers. So the point we're trying to make here is that yeah, you can go up to 80% of median. You're not supposed to go higher than that when you do a land use program. You can go higher, and sometimes we've done that for ownership units. But that when you start looking at your community, and if you're trying to help create a little broader breadth of housing affordability in your community, if you're at 80% of median for these units, you're probably going to be close to what current rents are in the community in general. Whereas at 70% of median, you are starting to have the units you're creating through this program might be a little more affordable than average rents and clearly more affordable than the newer units in the community. So that's why we sort of give you this information and why we're seeing why some of the people on the council say, well, you know, we have that data we showed you on jobs in the community and household income in the community. Why not get down to even 60 or 50% if you can? And that did work when you're doing a really, really, really large bonus. Here, we're not talking about as big of bonuses. So we think that on this question, we're saying that we think what makes sense, again, it's not a really big zone. This is the precedent that's been set with the TOD overlay, that we think the affordability provisions for TOD overlay would seem to make sense in this case here. But that's your call of that, or if you wanted to try to do something a little bit different. And again, that would affect the slides on how much, but that's what we're sort of suggesting for you to consider if you move forward with an affordability component.
Okay, any questions? Vice Chair?
Yeah, I'm a little curious how these change over time. I mean, 70% of median income for rental, are these adjusted, like I guess the requirements, are they adjusted annually or at any increment?
Right.
You know, I'm just wondering
Yes.
about the gap between how this changes and how median income might change, you know.
So, right, this is tied to a figure produced by the federal government. It's called the HUD median incomes, and that number is updated every year by the federal government, and I believe they might be some years a little bit later than other years, but I can't think of a year in which they've never adjusted it. Now, we've been doing this long enough, there have been some years it's been flat. There was even during the recession, first time in 30 years for me, it actually went backwards. All the members of ARCH worked together and made a policy statement that if the median income that one year went backwards, we just kept it flat. We didn't make people reduce their, any builders reduce their rents or anything like that. So, so generally, that is a figure that historically, I'm getting too old because this percentage change has been changing over time. Used to be 3% or more on average, some years a little bit more, some years a little bit less. In the past, it's been around 2.5%, especially when you average in with the recession years. And then the last couple of years, it's actually been in excess of 4% the last couple of years. But long term, it's been averaging just around 3% or a little bit less the last 10 years, which is, when I used to do development, I could never get a bank to accept underwriting that assumed more than a 3% a year increase in rent. So again, which makes sense if you think about rental housing on the macro market. If your median income isn't changing at some point, people don't have the income to pay. So, but it's something that is adjusted every year. That's one of the things we do at ARCH is we notify all landlords who have requirements and let them know what that increase has been.
And they're required then to do...
Excuse me?
They're required then to meet that new threshold?
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Well, they don't have to. I mean, we give them a maximum.
Yeah, it's a maximum.
It's a maximum. and they can charge that or less. During the recession, we had some new buildings came online where they weren't even renting the market rent units at 80% of median. So they obviously weren't charging 80% for the 80% units. But that's now back. So anyway, so it's an annual adjustment.
When we discussed affordable housing last year, I thought you said that the tenants who qualify for these median income affordable rents have to keep their income below those levels to still qualify for those discounted rents. Is that right?
That's 2/3 were correct.
Okay.
There is an ongoing, for rental housing. We don't do this for ownership housing. Ownership housing is only at time of acquisition. For rental housing, there is an annual check on income, and they are, let's say a unit is at 70% of median. That's the income limit when they move in.
Yeah.
Once they're in, we allow it to go higher,
Yeah.
but there is like an incremental increase they're allowed to have and still be eligible. So we don't want someone to go like 2 or 3% above that limit and then not be eligible anymore. So that's more and more other funding programs work the same way, where move-in is at the set rent level. Once you're in, you can go to a certain amount, but it's a 15% at least increase over that number. Sometimes, no, it's actually more than that. It's about a 20% increase. And if you do go over that one, then we figure by then you could probably stay in that building and afford the market rent. And so therefore, we have a provision in the covenants that say either you move into another unit in the building, if you want, you move out, and you pay market rent, or you can stay in your unit, and the builder can say, if they're in a 2-bedroom unit, I'll take the next 2-bedroom, and I'll make that into an affordable unit. So we give them flexibility to move the designated units around over time.
Wait, let's say they leased up their building. They built the building, they've leased it up. Let's say a quarter of them are affordable at 80%.
Right.
They lease it up to these tenants who have the income below the 80% King County median income. Somebody goes well above the 80%, more than the 3% you're saying there's a tolerance for. Let's say they get to 85 or 90.
Right.
You're saying that the covenants require the now landlord of this building, the owner of this building, to say to the tenant, you can either move to another market rate unit in this building or stay in your unit, but another unit's going to become affordable to compensate for it?
When it becomes vacant.
When it becomes vacant.
When it becomes vacant, right. Okay.
Okay.
This is something we've done
So does
for...
the tenant who had the increased income then have to pay market rent then
Yes,
for that unit?
right. That gets switched to a market rate unit,
Okay.
and then we have to replace that unit with an affordable, but we let them do it through turnover.
Okay. And what do the covenants require in terms of verifying that their income really is at a certain point? I mean, the tenants would have an incentive to state their income is not increased enough to disqualify them
Right,
from
and
affordability.
we haven't seen many households who have increased that much. To a point where they trigger that.
My
It's
question
happened-
is,
how do we do
verify
it? Right.
that?
So it's the same form as when they move in. It's a one-page form
Yeah.
that says different forms of income they have to state, and then they have to provide a tax return,
Okay.
a copy of their tax return to sort of verify, because those things start calling out the things that are in there.
Yeah.
And then they sign a little one-page statement that says, if we in any way find that you are misrepresenting your information, that provides cause for losing your rights to an affordable unit.
They have to provide every year a copy of their federal income tax return
Yes,
to justify qualifying for the continued discount. Okay,
correct.
thanks.
All right. So, any other questions or comments about the affordability level?
Let's move. Yeah, no, apparently not.
Okay. All right. So now, this is where the more complicated component or options are presented to you. So that is, how many units are affordable? And there are basically two approaches that can be used. One is you state, we've changed your zoning. We've done our math, and we're saying all buildings provide X percent. Often it's 10%. It's been in a number of cases. Of your units will meet whatever the affordability level requirement is. That's typically an approach that has been used in rezones in which they just change outright what you're allowed to do. So when you look at the TOD overlay, they still kept the base, and you choose how high you go. And it's not by right you go right to the top. You sort of work your way there. But if you sort of just, like in downtown Redmond, they just changed their heights, changed FAR, and they said everyone is eligible to use that. Based on the math of looking at that zone and what you are able to do now, we want to set it at, and in Redmond it's 10% at 80% of median. So that's the first approach. The second approach is like you use in the downtown, which is you keep some kind of base. And if you go above that base, then you incrementally do, based on how much you go above the base, there'll be a formula for every X square feet or X units. One of those is affordable, however you define it. So that is how they did it in the overlay district here. It's also what was done in Bellevue and the Bel Red, which is another very, very large district. I mean, that is a district that has zoning capacity for thousands and thousands of units and has 2 light rail stations going in, and they expect a significant. They kept a low base FAR, and so they're using an FAR approach, and if you go above it, then a certain portion of that above it goes go affordable. So those are, and then you have Sammamish, which did both. Sammamish actually did a baseline increase in zoning, which required a certain percentage, and then they had capacity under their environmental review for another 500 units within the neighborhood, and builders were allowed to buy those units for affordability. So they actually did a combination. Again, though, that's a whole downtown area, so it's a fairly large area that has a couple thousand housing units capacity. So those are the 2 different basic approaches. The other element, and this is almost to some degree related to the first slide and the second slide, is some cities have also said, you know, if you want to give us less units but make them more affordable, we will give you that option. So if your requirement is to do 10% at 80% of median in the first approach, they might say, if you give us units at 50% of median, you can, every one of those 50% units counts like it's 2 units at 80% of median. And that's totally a builder's call. And the logic behind considering doing that is twofold. One, you may see that in the community you have needs at a lower level, but it feels like that might be too hard of a push to ask all builders to do. And so you say, let's leave that totally for those who want to. The other is that when I've interviewed builders over the years, some of them prefer to have less units restricted. And so they are happy to do fewer units at a more affordable level because they want less of their overall building to be restricted. So your builder right here is building in Redmond right now, and he had a requirement for 20% at 80% of median. He is choosing the city's option. We're pretty sure, I can't say for sure, he's strongly considering the option to give the city 10% at 50% of median. And that's totally his call, but that's an option that's on the books for someone to consider. So that's sort of the context on the number. And so what we've done here is for each, based on our looking at the numbers for that chart you saw earlier and looking at land values and looking at what rents are and market rents, if you went with the first approach and the affordability level that was on the first two slides back, we would suggest that 10% of the total project be affordable at that moderate income level. The math seems to work right at that with those two combined. If you were to set a base level and then increase it based on that base level, we are suggesting that for every 4 extra units, 1 would be affordable at a moderate income level.
And what's moderate again?
That's the 70% for rental and 80% for ownership.
Thank you.
Okay. And then on the third point, again, very similar to what Redmond does, is to sort of put in your definitions that if you provide a unit as a low income level, that would equal 2 moderate income units.
Okay. Questions? No?
Okay.
Commissioner?
it would seem, since we got a little smaller areas we're looking at, that the less affordable units option should be considered, I would think, because they just don't have that many, they're not going to have that many units, I would guess.
I've been surprised over the years that, well, I was asked this question by Bellevue Council last night, because we're doing something for their downtown and Eastgate areas right now, so I was with them last night doing the exact same conversation. And the council at the end goes, well, is anyone going to use it? And I go, well, that's a really hard question to answer, if it's, because they're using an incentive approach. And I said, part of it is because the building community is there's just such a wide range in what's driving them and how they want to do business and how they do business. And I said, I've seen situations where, like the one I just gave you, Main Street chose the 50% units. I've had other situations where a builder has said, you may have changed my zone. I don't want to do affordable housing. It's just not in my MO. I don't like it. I've been surprised that in the ownership area, we did have some builders in Redmond pick the 50% option, and it was because they just wanted to have as many units as possible be market rate, because the market was so strong at the moment. Rental, I've seen it less, but now here's Main Street maybe considering doing that in Redmond. So builders are looking at, and deals are different enough. I hate to predict and say this is exactly how it works. So that's one of the reasons it's maybe nice to have these kind of options here, is you let a builder have a couple different ways they can do it.
But then we can do A and not B and C, or we could do A and C.
Correct.
But you can't do A and B together.
Correct.
And you could do B and C together.
Correct. Sammamish did A and B, but that's because they had a really big site. They had a big zone. You could only do A and B together if you had a really big area and you had some pretty big up zones. But that's not what we're looking at here. So yes, I would say A and B do not work together here.
And if you give them more options, then that would give them more choices, and you'd think it'd be better to go
Appealing
with
to them to have that.
to the combo, yeah.
Yeah, could you do that one more time, please?
Well, I think you can do all the combos except A and B.
Okay,
Right.
so you could do A and C.
Yep, or B and C.
B and C.
Yeah.
Or just A or
just one
just
of
B.
Right.
I don't think you can do just C, because you have to have A or B to go with it.
Yeah, good point.
Okay?
So, we were taking this a step at a time. We're kind of waiting till the end, but if people want to sort of take up each of these as we go, I mean, I know we let
This
the first
is a good
one
pause
go.
point to see if there's reaction. because
Yeah, I
we've
get
now
that,
seen
and
the
it
first
sounds like Commissioner McDonald had a question. Everybody else is pretty comfortable with it, but I'm just sort of polling our commission to see if we want to sort of focus on these as we, and vote on each one of these as we go, or wait till we get to the end and then take them all up.
Well,
Commissioner Baker?
I'd like to know, with these different options, do they have to be mandated or can they be optional? I'm like totally optional.
And that's what I think we're saying is A creates a mandatory approach.
Right.
B creates a totally voluntary approach.
Get it. Okay.
Okay? So we wanted to, and we're not making a recommendation over A or B. We're just recommending if you pick A, we have a recommendation. If you pick B, we have a recommendation.
Okay.
So do other commissioners have a preference on voting now or discussing now or waiting till we get to the end? And I'm sensitive to Arthur's time, the fact that it's 6:40, he may have to leave shortly after 6.
Right.
So it may be helpful to get everything we can from Arthur first, let him go, and then we kind of kick it around. We wouldn't have the benefit of Arthur's response.
Well, we can
At
do
least-
question and answer as long as I can, right, till 7:15 and,
Yeah, right.
right.
Well,
Okay.
can I ask you a quick question on
Yes.
B? So it's not mandatory, because they could do 10 units and they wouldn't have to
Well,
comply
you-
with it. But if they did 12 units, they would.
So you're saying if I go back to the chart, let's go back up to the chart. And this is where you'd have to make a decision is what's the base? You have to have a base to work from. And so, where's that chart? Here we go. So if you were in, let's just take the whole zone. Let's not take little subparcels. So you have a zone, the NB zone, which has a 8 units to the acre currently, and that would allow 15 units. So what we sort of suggested, if you do B, do you set it at, yes, you have the right to go up to the 20, 36, or 24, whichever one you're looking at for which zone, but anything between 8 and that higher number is, you're going to have to buy your way into that, okay? Now, I would make, this is sort of an editorial comment, Redmond, I'm passing on the logic of why Redmond went mandatory with their downtown. And that may not be the right logic here, but I just want to put perspectives out there that I've heard over the years, which is we're changing this zoning in downtown Redmond because we want 5-story buildings. We don't want people building 2-story buildings. So why not just sort of go to what's allowed, make it outright allowed, and then if someone wants to do less, that's their choice. But that's almost, in terms of our planning, we need housing, we need capacity. We want affordability for it, and it may cost you a little bit more, but that's your choice, because we really, when we looked at this area, decided it's an area that should be 5 stories. And so we don't want to sort of leave it to the builder completely. They can build whatever height they want, but we gave them the ability to do something we kind of want them to do, so we want to mandate it. So that was sort of the logic in Redmond, why they just went to like in Bel Red. Bel Red, it's at one level, and you could stay at that low level, but nobody is. Everybody is choosing to use the higher FAR. So it can work to sort of use the second approach. So with that second approach, you need to set your base, and we would assume that base could be 8, but you could set it 8 per acre, but you could set it at some different base. But you do need to have a base below your maximum.
So if somebody built a 15-unit housing project in one of these zones, the base is 8, they have 7 in excess, those are the bonus units, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ratio is 1 affordable unit for every 4 bonus units. They would have to build
1.75, and we're going to come to the 0.75.
Yeah.
We'll come to that.
Okay.
That's one of the elements of the presentation.
Okay.
Okay. So. So any other clarification questions on A and B and C? Maybe that's the way to handle questions right up front for now.
Vice Chair?
I'm still struggling with the math on this. So on A and on B, it's 10% on A, obviously. It's 1 out of every 4 then above the baseline. Which of these two, given the size that we're looking at in these two zones, which is likely to provide more or less affordable housing units? And I know there's variations and all
Right.
that, but
They're intended to be about the same if someone goes to 24, they should be about the same, especially if they go to the full allowed zoning. If you do less, then you're going to get a little bit more in option A, because to 10% is of the total, and where the B, the math is on an increment. But at that top end, the math was done to be roughly comparable, essentially the same. I mean, there are small enough areas that you can't be exactly the same, but we tried to make the math as close as possible the same.
So in these zones, and as we adopt the affordability pieces of it, does it leave it open for the developer to decide if they're rental or ownership?
Yes.
So the city doesn't mandate that part. It's just the affordability part.
Correct. And in fact, the provisions will say that the affordable units need to be the same tenure as the market rate, but the builder chooses what that tenure is.
What do you mean by tenure?
Rental versus ownership. So if the market rate builder is building ownership units, then the affordable are ownership. And if they're building rental units, they're doing that. And we even have provisions if they ever convert it from rental to ownership, we can deal with that.
I thought you were saying the word T-E-N-U-R-E.
Correct.
This is in the context of housing.
Yes.
Okay.
This is when the real estate classes I took.
Okay. Anybody else? Go ahead.
Okay? All right. So I'm not going to dwell on this unless you have a question. I just wanted to put this is sort of a more simplified version of the chart I did last time that sort of walks you through the math of calculating the cost to the builder versus the value of the benefit you're providing. I'm not planning on dwelling on that at this moment unless you have any questions. I just wanted you to have that. But if you do have questions, happy to answer those. So the next big question is, so do you have a size project in which this is triggered? And that has to be looked at a little bit differently if you choose option A or option B. In option B, it's a little more straightforward. If you go X number of units above the base, then you know you're going to have to do affordability, and that's how you would define the threshold. For when you do a percentage of the total, that's where different jurisdictions have sort of said, is there a point in which we say if you're below a certain number, you don't have to do anything, okay? And in Redmond, that number was 10, and that's sort of an old number that was used under the logic, if you didn't have a requirement for one full unit, then what do you do for a fractional unit? So until you get to 1, you're not mandated to do it. From a combination of cities like Kirkland seeing a number of small projects benefiting from rezones, and that also we're looking at something with Bothell right now where it's the same. It's very similar to what you have here. It's a relatively large increase from the base that you're looking from, but the total number of units is never that large. Then Kirkland went with the 4 units approach, and I think that's what Bothell's leaning towards. And the logic, I think, there was that you're to a point where you are starting to see benefit, but what it does trigger is, well, how do you deal with a fractional requirement? Okay? And I think that's on the next slide. So why don't I jump to the next slide, and then we'll come back to here, which is, no, it's not, well, it's sort of under alternative compliance. Well, I'll just describe it. I think it's 2 slides down maybe. What Kirkland does is they allow, and this is what's also being proposed in Bothell, it's only at the commission, it hasn't gone to council yet, is if you have a fractional requirement, you can meet that fractional requirement through an in-lieu payment automatically, okay? And so that is the approach they use. So if you're required to do 1.4, you do 1 unit, and then you do an in-lieu payment for the 0.4, okay? So that you're getting some benefit and you're not getting completely off the hook, but you're not being triggered for a whole unit, okay? And so if you're going to go down to 4, go to a lower number, which you remember what I said at the very beginning when you look at that slide, there are parcels here that are pretty small whose current base allowed is only like 4 units, is that if you do that, though, the fairness thing seems to be if you're trying to have the economic impact proportionate, then you need to find a way other than producing a full unit. And so that's where alternative compliance comes in. And so that's then the next sort of section. And what Kirkland and Bothell have written into their provisions is you are automatically allowed to do alternative compliance for fractional units, okay? So that's kind of the way they approach that.
What would alternative compliance be other than paying a fee to the city commensurate
So-
with the affordability
Right.
requirement?
So what the cities have done in East King County is they have generally taken an approach of saying, we're going to leave that door open. We're not going to give you an automatic, yes, you can, but we're going to leave that door open for you. And I talked for one city, we talked to a number of builders about how to structure this. And they were all okay with this kind of approach. So it basically says maybe you provide them on another site that the city approves. You might make a payment, or maybe there's something we haven't thought of. But what we're going to measure you against is providing something of equivalent affordability as if you had done it on site. And it says you propose developer, but that's the measuring stick we're going to use, and it's the city's discretion whether or not to accept. But what I said is, again, for smaller projects, it says, but for smaller projects, you automatically are allowed to do, for that fractional unit, the alternative compliance of a payment. So that's sort of the approach, and some cities have not allowed alternative compliance. Most have been, again, just sort of like the different affordability level. At least it leaves a door open. An example of where it's been used, and this might actually play out here. Let's say you don't have a big land area, but maybe there's two builders who are building, two people each get half of those lots, and there's two relatively small projects. The builder might go, hey, builder B will do my unit, and we're building close enough in time, or he's agreed to build my unit, and can we do that? And that's where, like, Redmond has approved it. One builder was building two sites within a block of each other, and they were both relatively small. And they said, fine, we'll let you build the affordable units because there's only one or two required, or when you combined them, it was like one. Then we'll let you do it that way, and you just do one unit there. So that's and here, because you have a number of smaller parcels, I could see that might be an arrangement that works for people in this situation. But who knows what you can predict, so we sort of keep that door open and say, the measuring stick is, do we feel we're getting comparable affordability?
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, so you have this provision for the TOD overlay,
Yep.
and the only thing that's not in there is, for your TOD overlay, you do not have an in lieu fee option right now in the city. So
We do not have what?
you do not for the overlay district. It must be, if you want to propose an alternative to doing it on site.
In lieu fee, I think is what you said.
Yes, I said in lieu fee,
Commissioner
which is
McDonald
the
wondered,
payment.
Because I wondered the same thing.
Okay, see, I'm sorry, I've been doing this too
Sort
long.
of slurred it in there.
Yeah, okay.
What was that?
Yeah, something like
Well,
that.
you know, he's only got 40 minutes. He's got to talk fast.
So you're, right now, you have in the, and when you look at the code, you'll see there's a lot of language already in the overlay for alternative compliance, except it does not include in lieu payment. And so we're saying that, especially if you go with the first option and you make the number lower and there's potential for fractionals units, we would suggest you strongly consider keeping that door open or even outright allowing that and adding that to the in lieu section. And I think I don't know if we drafted language in the code that would cover that or not. I can't recall.
It's a referral on the, I don't think the language is quite right.
Okay, and that's where, again, other cities have that. We would bring in language there. So again, we tried to, again, this is an area where we, for the most part, are picking up with where the city landed in the TOD district overlay.
Questions? Vice Chair? Vice Chair had his hand up. It's a race. Go ahead first. You're going second.
Flip a coin?
Oh, okay, I'll go.
Okay, whatever.
We don't want to flip a coin. A judge did that once and he got reprimanded.
You should have. You should have. Or she.
If you're doing B and C, or
Right.
you could have a incremental
That's true.
adjustment down to from 70 to 60% or something like that. Is that something that an alternative?
Yes.
Clever.
That's another, that would be, we could build that in. Right now, the way we have it, what we put out here on the slides is it's 80%, it's the mod or it's the low. Now, you know, your city has a reputation for making this complicated with your questions. You have, the TOD was not my idea. The TOD overlay approach with all that craziness was because of the wish list that your group put out there. There is a city or two that has a rolling scale. So under alternative compliance, they could propose, like, I'll give you a unit at 60% of median instead of at 70% because of how the math works. And so you could build that into alternative compliance.
Or if you just leave alternative compliance to the discretion of the city manager,
Yes.
they can go more creative than that.
Yes. And the only comment I'm making is, would you want, if you go with alternative compliance, you might want to call out alternative compliance could also mean variability in the affordability level too, that's, just to make it clear, because what we sometimes see happens at the council, Diaz, is how much are we handing over to the city manager? And we want to provide some level of guidance in the code so that they have some bounds. So if that's an idea you like, I would only suggest you just put something in there so it's clear that that's on the table too. Okay? Okay?
Yeah?
Any other, you had,
Yeah, Vice Chair.
Excuse me. So I wondered about the timing of these in lieu payments. I think I read some other material that sort of explained how that works and how the payments have to, the units, however the payments are structured, the units have to be sort of more or less built during the same, I think, time. I can't remember the exact language, same time period. But I wonder how ironclad that is. In other words, if you have this option, I mean, is this going to defer actual construction of housing?
right.
In practice.
Right.
And I know there's discretion, about city approvals and such, but, so that was my question reading through that option.
So
Or one of my questions.
I think that would be one that, just reading the language a little more carefully, the intent, like, we are actually working on one agreement right now in Redmond where there is about a 5-month lag between the two. The market's going to be 5 months in advance, but we are tying things like, you got to, so that's acceptable because it's a real site and we have a real developer for the other one. What you want to be careful is, I'll do it off-site, don't worry, I'll get around to it someday, kind of thing.
So does it really depend on how, I guess how the language is written or how this is structured, that you don't get these years and years?
If
Plus you
that's
said there's not
right.
a lot of, buildable sites necessarily in Kenmore, so.
Right. And often, like the issue that came up for the meeting I have to go to tonight, which is Redmond adopting something for property taxes where the same issue has come up, and they wanted a little more direction to the city planning director about what did nearby mean, what did proximity mean, because they want the off-site to not just be anywhere, and so they've been debating the council, what does that mean? So what I would suggest is, if we're to the point where you want to do something, if there's issues like this related to alternative compliance, we should look at the language and see if any tweaking is worthwhile in order to provide the right direction so that there is some level of direction to the city manager about how wide can they go with alternative compliance, or you could leave it wide open.
Okay.
Okay?
Thanks.
Okay? And then I think this is the last slide, is just to sort of remind you of what are standard provisions, and these are pretty much what you use. These are all in your current provisions for the overlay district, and they're pretty much called out in state legislation. So the first is you have a covenant that sort of is recorded, that deals with the duration, the timing, and affordability and other elements. The designation of the units, there has to be some level of dispersal. The bedroom unit mix is comparable, I mentioned earlier. That gives some discretion on size, but most cities, including you, have some. You can't have them be a quarter the size. There's some limitations on how much smaller they can be. And then the tenure issue that we talked about earlier. And then
I don't
finally,
understand. I'm looking at the word and I still don't know what it means in this context.
I second
okay,
that.
well, we'll edit the slide for you. So mark
What?
it. We'll edit the material. So it's basically saying that the affordable units will be the same form of occupancy in terms of being rental or ownership as the rest of the building.
Interesting.
Okay?
I have a question.
Yes.
Duration of affordability.
Yes.
Well, how long is it typically?
It is for land use, it's been for rental the life of the permitted use, which is what we've been doing for 25 years, and there's now over 1,000 units with that provision.
Yeah.
And for ownership, because of FHA and Fannie Mae, we're 30 or 50 years, whatever we can get away with in terms of their underwriting guidelines. So the code language, there's code language in there saying we can go less than life of the use if necessary in order to get federal financing requirements
Interesting.
met.
That differs from what another lawyer told me who works in the real estate industry, but which is not to say you're wrong. They may misinform me or something. But so to say that the duration of affordability, when somebody buys a discounted
Yes.
housing unit,
Yes.
call it a single-family residence, they have to sell it for the discounted price.
Plus an inflation factor.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a built-in inflation factor for them, just like the rents go up every year with median income.
Right,
There's an increase in value. That's home ownership. You don't want to keep someone from not getting some appreciation. We're just
Well, you're not. You're only getting, what you said was CPI.
Well, the formula we've used for ownership is the average of increase in median income and home resale values in East King County. So we use a different formula for ownership for
Not CPI.
It's not CPI.
Okay.
And so we're trying to balance what incomes are doing with also, this is a real estate investment for
Yeah.
these people. They're just paying less, though.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get them appreciation roughly based on what they paid. So we want them to have the fruits of ownership go with it. But so that's the formula. After 3 tries on different formulas that behave differently in different market conditions,
Yeah.
this seems to be a good one that gives.
Well, it's better than CPI.
It's,
In
yes.
a fast appreciating market
And
like this.
it also has a tendency, and we put in some safety guards, like we don't make it go down, like it during the recession, unless the market really dips. So they actually get a little bit of protection. So I've been doing
And wouldn't that then violate the affordability? The market goes down, and then
because the incomes.
they're allowed to sell it for more than what the market would allow?
No, we'll never sell it for more than what the
Right.
market would bear. I mean, that's
But
obviously.
you said it won't go down. You have a
They
protection.
afford. We won't. You remember how I said if the median income went down, we still keep it flat.
Okay.
So what we're saying is we don't make the index go from when you bought it. We don't make the index go lower than from when you bought it. So we had people who owned for a while and it went down and heavy, and we said no. We said if you bought it for $150,000, we're not going to. If the market won't let you sell it for $150,000, you can't.
Affordability index doesn't
But
go
if
down.
right, yeah.
The price could go down, but the affordability index doesn't go
Right.
down.
And then whoever buys it, whatever they buy it for, from when they buy it to when they sell it, we do that same measurement for.
I've heard realtors balk at this when they have clients looking for property, say, I don't want to buy a property with that kind of covenant.
Right.
My clients, I want them to get the full benefit of market appreciation. And I know that's a choice,
That's a choice.
but I'm just bringing up there's a downside in the
And
industry.
there's a lot of
disincentive for
right.
people to buy those units.
Right now, we're finding the units sell really fast.
Yeah.
In a slow market, they sell slow, just like
Yeah,
everything
yeah.
else.
Okay.
So, and then we have built in a provision. I thought you were going to go to another place, but I'll go there.
Okay.
You go, well, what happens in year 31 if you have a 30-year restriction?
Yeah.
It's still a permanent affordability program. It's created through land use. What the provisions of the covenant say is if you turn around, if we have a foreclosure and it gets sold at market because we have to subordinate the FHA, anytime a unit leaves the program, that the homeowner will only get what they would have gotten had the program been in place, and if there's any net above that, that goes back to the city for affordable housing programs. And we've
Well,
actually
I don't even
enforced,
understand how they leave the program when you said it was
because year
permanent.
31.
Oh, at 31.
Okay, because we had to put a time limit on to deal with FHA and Fannie Mae, we then put a counter provision in that says, okay, we might lose the unit, but
you
you,
still
the
have to-
homeowner, you're only going to get what you would have gotten under the program.
Yeah.
And if there's any excess, that goes back to the local government for affordable housing. And that's happened once or twice. We've had that happen a couple times.
Okay.
And then finally, the design. Exterior needs to be comparable to the market rate. Interior needs to be comparable to entry level for rental or ownership. And so for ownership, if the market rate units have a lot of really high-end finishes, we don't necessarily expect that for the affordable units. Most rental builders don't do a distinguishing finish level. But we do leave that door open so that those are little things, between the unit size and the finishes, those are little things we do to make it so that the impact is relatively, is reasonable to a builder. So those are little things that the cities have done to help deal with the impact of providing the affordable units. So those are the standard provisions.
Okay.
So I have almost 10 minutes if you have follow-up or if you're done.
Did you want to talk about mandatory versus voluntary, which I think is probably the biggest question
Okay.
of all? My humble opinion.
And I think I've
You've
giving
already
you the
alluded
logic.
to this, and this is our call. You haven't
Right.
made a recommendation, your staff hasn't made a recommendation on
Correct.
it. Okay.
There's no right answer on this one.
Well, you gave a little editorial earlier.
Yeah, I
on.
gave you the Redmond story.
Right.
Right, so that's the editorial on the Redmond story. There's that one.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Any other questions?
Well, I
ahead.
got a comment and
Yeah.
maybe a question in there. Since the density is going up, the owner of the property is not losing on this. They're,
The value of their property goes up too.
yeah.
Right. That's-
And are we doing the increased density because of the Growth Management Act? Is that what's pushing the density up?
I don't think that we are specifically doing that for the Growth Management Act. We currently have our capacity targets that are mandated through the King County countywide planning policy. So we have to meet a certain amount of housing units, and we've met those. In terms of the density increase, the staff recommendation is that 8 dwelling units per acre is almost a single-family density. And if what we're talking about are small commercial nodes, the opportunity to do multifamily or mixed use is enhanced, and particularly in that north area where you were talking about potential proximity to transit and that kind of thing. So the purpose of increasing the density in the north area to 36 is because of its location and to encourage mixed-use multifamily there. In the south NB zone, we did not increase it to the same level, but we tried to keep it comparable to the surrounding multifamily zoning. 8 dwelling units per acre, again, is lower than the surrounding multifamily densities in that area.
So, and I would add that, like if you've been following what Seattle's been doing the last few years, it almost sounds like affordability is driving rezones. They want to get more affordability, and the only way they can get there is rezone. That's not where I've ever come from. It's if a city is looking at their zoning for whatever reason, and it's changing development capacity, then as part of that the affordability isn't what's driving the question up front. It's the kind of things that Lori just said. But if you're at that point, you should look at the question of, now, because of what we're doing, is there this opportunity, because there's a benefit being achieved, to get some affordability as a result of that? I used to work for a company. We made a business out of getting rezones done. And when we worked with those cities, we said, there's a difference between us and every other builder you've ever talked to, which is tonight, we are going to give you that back by doing affordability in some of the units. So that's how it's that same philosophy. So we're not asking for this because you need affordability. It's other things are driving the zoning question, and so this is a tag-along question that goes with that.
Anything else? Vice Chair.
Yeah, as long as we have Arthur here, I know you get
Yeah.
five minutes. But
Yep.
so, based on, I suppose, not only your experience but historical records or data, what's your sense of which is more effective in addressing affordability, mandatory or voluntary? I realize that's a pretty large question, but can you give us some insights into experience elsewhere in which?
So
I know it varies, but I'm just trying to get a little more information from you.
So we've actually been around this question in Bellevue a lot the last year. I would say it depends on your circumstance. So if you have a circumstance where the rezone is from 20 to 24 units per acre, not a big one, maybe that's not the best example to use, then voluntary is probably not going to happen. If what your base is so low that it's not likely to happen at that base, and then you have an incentive system, i.e. Bell Red, then it's likely that will work just fine. And in general, there have been a lot of studies in different states that builders will more times than, in voluntary situations, like in Mercer Island, they had a range of things you could choose from to get your extra. They chose everything but affordable housing. So Mercer Island changed their rules a couple years ago saying, no, we need the affordability. The other things are nice, but we need the affordability. So I would say that if the base is low enough and it's not likely anything would happen, then it probably can work okay as an incentive approach. I would probably lean a little bit more towards the Redmond approach, which is if this is what we think is the right thing, we have affordability, we're giving you something fair in return, then it makes it more clear. And that is one thing I have heard from the builders sometimes, that if it's just required, as long as you give them enough window to know it's required, they can deal with it. It's when it's, well, is it required or not, and what's the situation, that creates some uncertainty sometimes for them. More certainty of a way to go helps them. That's why when we did alternative compliance, there's no certainty there, and their comment was, that's okay, I know what the mandatory approach is in Redmond, and the other just gives me lots of flexibility. So I would say here, I'm not pushing for one over the other. Mandatory is a little more straightforward, but I'm not pushing hard.
Why
for
would
it.
a voluntary approach? Why would zoning language that makes clear that this is a voluntary option create confusion or uncertainty for the builder?
I'm just talking from lots of conversations and experience over the years. I mean,
You don't know the why. You just said this is my experience.
It's to some extent, well, am I really going to build to the 16 and what's that, or am I going to do the 24? And some builders are doing it one way. So it creates uncertainty in negotiating with the landowner, because you're saying, I can't give you full value because I have some of that has to be afforded. And one person might be looking at it one way, who's at 16 to the acre, and the one who's at 24 is different. So it doesn't create as much an apples-to-apples situation. So when they're talking to the landowner, if I had to guess, that's what would be behind that statement.
Lori?
I was just going to say, when I was looking over these code amendments, the one thing that I thought, and I certainly do not know as much about this as Arthur does, but when I was thinking, okay, so for neighborhood business zone, we're going to keep it at 8. And then as an incentive, you can get up to 24 or 36 if you provide affordability. I was thinking, well, but we don't really want it at 8. That's not what we want. We want more housing units. So wouldn't it be better potentially to say, we're going to rezone it to 24 or 36, and as a corollary, you're going to have to provide an affordable housing unit or two that's not so big that it's a vast number of units. So then, hopefully, we're going to get more. It eliminates the uncertainty of whether we're going to get the density that might be good, so that we get more housing units.
That was the editorial about Redmond.
That's the red, right?
Yeah,
That's the red.
exactly.
Right, but why couldn't you just rezone it to say you have a desirable level of density, 16 units, for example, but you get 8 more if you're going to make, under this formula for affordability.
Yeah, you could, and that was, I think,
That's why I
what
think
Arthur was saying
we're now
about
coming
setting
in,
the base.
Like in Bellevue, we're now to a point, the staff has gotten to the point, from the direction they've gotten from councils, certain neighborhoods, they know they need to take one approach versus another approach because of what might be going on in those neighborhoods. Here, you're right on that edge, so I can't, but that's why I would say, I said if I would lean slightly, it would be towards what Lori just said for the reason Lori said, which is why did you change the zoning in the first place? Which is you think that these are locations where that kind of density feels appropriate. So,
Okay. Anything else? 7:14 and about 40 seconds, Arthur.
okay.
I mean, you got a little time here. Don't want to cut you off.
I can never answer a question in 10 seconds. You know that by now.
But we don't know what traffic's like either.
I'm going the other way, though.
Okay.
That's,
Time for that. Thank you, Arthur.
okay. And pass on follow-up questions through staff, and I'll be
Okay.
happy to follow up with you.
All right.
And thank you for listening to all that.
Of course.
Can
Of
we
course.
take
You want a recess?
a little stretch?
All right.
Stand up?
How's that?
Okay, I'm all good.